Hello friends. The leaf blower has stopped outside, so let's see if we can record this video on Jeremiah chapters 34 and 35. First of all, chapter 34. We have two events described in this particular chapter. The first one is a meeting between Jeremiah and King Zedekiah, in which Jeremiah tells Zedekiah that he will have to face his suzerain, King Nebuchadnezzar, as a rebellious vassal. And as you know, this will not end well for King Zedekiah. The one reassuring feature was the promise that his life would be spared, but Zedekiah needed to know that the victory of Nebuchadnezzar was certain. The second event tells of a solemn covenant that King Zedekiah had entered to grant release to all Hebrew slaves. But it was a short-lived freedom, wasn't it? When the Babylonian siege was momentarily lifted, the Emancipation Proclamation was reversed, and they forced their fellows back into slavery. Of course, this was a predictable response, wasn't it, from people whom Jeremiah had exposed time and time again as covenant breakers. Chapter 35 tells of another one of Jeremiah's symbolic acts. We are introduced to one of the reactionary groups in the land, the Rechabites, and you might know that they seem to have a lot in common with another group called the Nazarites. The Rechabites, this nomadic group, was opposed to all aspects of settled living. They refused to drink wine, to own vineyards, or to work at the cultivation of grapes. Jeremiah summons them to the temple, sets wine before them, and urges them to drink. Have some wine, he says in verse 5. This was a good test of obedience to the precepts of their founder to invite them to drink wine. But as you know, they would not drink. For 2½ centuries, they had been faithful and obedient. So they were a powerful illustration of obedience for Jeremiah's message. This group had been scrupulous in their obedience to Jonadab, their founder. But Israel, with much more reason to obey the Lord, had never listened to him. And we're told that in verses 12 through 16, where the Lord says, I persistently and repeatedly sent my servants the prophets to my people, but they would not incline their ear to those prophets. In this particular symbolic act, Jeremiah is trying to tell his people what obedience really meant. Now let's talk about application. First of all, I think we had better not say that slavery in this case is wrong, although we were probably tempted to do so. Remember, this was a voluntary servitude by the Hebrews. They could voluntarily become slaves of their fellows. If they found themselves in dire circumstances and needed to support their families, they could become slaves. This was not a bad thing, but the law stipulated that every 7th year, those Hebrew slaves had to be liberated. So Zedekiah liberates them, but of course he reverses course and doesn't follow through on the command of God. Here is an example of people who started to obey the law of God, who started to submit themselves to God's will, but did not follow through. And of course, for us, the application is, let's follow through. Let's make it our will to submit to God's will, and no matter what happens, let's follow through on that decision. Number 2, rather than focus on the disobedience of Judah in chapter 35, I want us to focus on the obedience of the Rechabites. What a contrast between the loyalty and obedience of the Rechabites and the disloyalty and disobedience of God's people. For me, the application is that I want to be that example of loyalty and obedience, the example that the Rechabites were to Judah. I want to be that example. I want to model loyalty and obedience for those around me, for my friends, for my family, for those who are looking on. I will be loyal to God. I will obey him to the best of my ability, not just for my own sake, but for the sake of my loved ones who may be looking on. I know you feel the same way. Now for a very brief preview of chapter 36, where we find some fascinating information about Jeremiah's scrolls. All about scrolls and the written word. And our theme, again, in this chapter will be... No, I'm not going to tell you what that theme is. I want you to find it out for yourself, and I know that you want to do the same. So I'm going to hold back on giving you any more information about chapter 36. But it's going to be some interesting reading. And remember, we want to apply it to our lives every day. God bless you as you read through this book with me. I appreciate it. I'll see you in a few days as we talk about chapter 36.